a civilization in space that can live long and prosper, I think we can agree we need to have rules, regulations, and laws. We are joined by Michelle Hanlon, Executive Director of the Air and Space Law Program at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what it's like to be a space lawyer?
So I pinch myself every morning when I wake up because being a space lawyer is beyond fun. It's really exciting because as lawyers, we're so used to rules and regulations and find the case book, find the case law. But that doesn't happen in space law because there's not much out there. So we're pretty much making it up as we go along. So it's really fun. So I actually was a business attorney for 25 years before I turned my attention to space law. And what happened was I wanted to be an astronaut my whole life. I would still love to be an astronaut. And but I didn't do math. I couldn't figure out calculus. And so I thought, okay, that door is closed to me. And I went on and studied political science and had a wonderful, wonderful time practicing law. But both my sons are engineers, and both of them were starting to get very interested in space. I had always been a Star Trek baby, and they sort of reignited this love for space. And when I realized how important, we're on such an incredible threshold right now of, all of space is literally at our fingertips. And we do need laws, and we need to figure out how to keep the peace and try and build even more peace by harnessing space and its resources. And so I went back to school when I was 50, yes, and earned my advanced degree in air and space law. And now I teach space law and some air law courses, drone law courses here at the University of Mississippi.
What is the current state of law regarding space?
We actually have a treaty regime. There are 5 treaties that were negotiated through the United Nations. And listen to this, there's an entire committee, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that's devoted to helping us develop rules and regulations for space. And so they, in the 1960s and early 70s, they negotiated 5 treaties, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, followed by the Liability Convention, the Return and Rescue Agreement, and the Registration Convention, and something called the Moon Agreement, which we'll just put in a little special category over here. But the primary rule of law in space right now is the Outer Space Treaty. And that is really interesting because it's not actually a code of law. It says, hey, we're all going to space. What's the most important thing we want to think about? Keeping the peace in space. And so it is very much driven by how we're going to keep the peace. And so there's an entire Article 4. By the way, the entire treaty is only about 2 pages long. Okay. And it is a framework. But Article 4 makes it very clear, you cannot put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction anywhere in space. And every celestial body, including the moon, shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Now, mind you, it's not all of space, just the celestial bodies, but we're working on it. And so, but this is sort of, again, it says we are going to collaborate and cooperate in space to the best of our abilities. We are going to treat astronauts like envoys of all of humankind. We are not going to claim territory in space on behalf of any state. So when the United States planted the flag on the moon back in 1969, it wasn't a claim that the moon is now American. It was just a claim we got here first. Back in the 60s and 70s, of course, it was really just 2 countries in space, the US and the Soviet Union at the time. Today, we have so many more countries, and we even have private companies involved as well. The treaty is being tested by all these new activities. And so while we do have an excellent framework, there are a lot of gaps in the treaty that we need to start filling in.
Okay, thank you very much. Talking about those gaps, what do you think are some of the most, obvious that probably you are working on it at the moment, or is something that you feel there should be priority to focus the UN and between diplomacies between countries?
So there's 2 that come to mind immediately. One is orbital debris, and the other is space resource utilization. So orbital debris, there are about 8,500 satellites on orbit right now. Only about 4,000 or less are functioning. And we're seeing more and more satellites going into space. We have these constellations with Starlink, which plans 40,000. The Chinese are planning 40,000 small satellites. It's getting really crowded up there. And there's no law that says you have to clean up after yourself. So everyone just sends stuff up there and it stays up there and it's getting clogged. Imagine a road with a bunch of litter on it and you have to keep avoiding things, things that are operational, things that aren't. And on top of that, if you recall, in 2021, the Russians had an ASAT test and destroyed one of their own satellites. There's no law against that. It's totally fine. If you want to destroy your own satellite, go ahead and do it. It created a debris field, which actually put astronauts on the International Space Station in danger. No law against that. So here we have this huge gap in the law, and it's really becoming burdensome for this generation, for our generation and future generations. We need to clean up our orbit so that we don't lose our access to space. But there is no law that requires that at this point. And so that's a huge gap in the Outer Space Treaty. It has a provision, Article 9, that says you will have due regard for the activities of others. But nobody's interpreted that to say you can't leave your garbage in space. And so that's one of those gaps that we're really working on trying to fill right now. And there's a committee in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, a working group that's focused on the sustainable development of space, that's looking at orbit and how we're going to clean it up and how we can mitigate future damage. Of course, though, you recognize the same issues that we have on Earth because developing countries that haven't gotten to space yet are saying, well, now you're going to put more restrictions on us. We've never gotten to space, and now you're going to make it even more expensive for us by putting new rules in. So it's a really interesting balance that we have to deal with. But thankfully, we're looking at it. The other big issue is that space resource utilization. It's expensive to get stuff to space, right? We can't send our own bricks to build a house on the moon. We have to use the resources that we find in space. We have Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which states, as I noted, that no nation may claim territory in space by sovereignty or by any other means. And so there was a question about what that means. Does that mean you can't use anything from space? And some people say, yeah, no, if you use something in space, you should share the benefit of that use with everybody. The United States, President Obama signed a law in the United States in 2015 that said, wait, no, step back. The United States, interprets the Outer Space Treaty, Article 2, to say, you can't claim territory, but if you extract the resources, then those are yours. You can use them, you can sell them, you can do whatever you want if you take the resources out of the planet, out of the moon. That caused a little bit of controversy, as you can imagine, but people sort of began to realize, well, you kind of need, anybody who has a vision of going into space is going to have to use those resources. And so we see that same trend happening. Luxembourg, UAE, and Japan have all passed similar laws. And there's also a provision in the new Artemis Accords, which has 28 signatories, which says, yeah, if you extract the resources, you're not violating the Outer Space Treaty. And there was some, Russia called it an imperialist move, but China has been silent because China needs to extract the resources because they want to create a lunar base as well. And so this is one of those gaps where the Outer Space Treaty needs interpretation. What does that actually mean? And it looks right now as if the world is saying, hey, that means you can extract the resources and use them.
Do you think it would benefit to have a clearer, like that is stated, how much resource can you extract and for what purpose, etc.?
So it's really interesting because that is one of the things that comes up, because a lot of people say, when we interpret Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, people say, well, the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese have already brought moon rocks back, and nobody's saying that they can't own them, so we must permit that somehow. What's the more interesting question is, okay, in order to extract the resources, you have to set up an operation, right? You have to put some kind of structure there. And when that structure is there and you're mining the water off the moon or whatever it is, you're kind of claiming territory, aren't you? Because you're saying, I'm here and I don't want you to get too close to me, and I'm mining this area. And so that's really what we need to focus on is what are we going to call that? Is that a claim of territory? Is that a claim of property? Well, if we allow resource extraction, and again, sorry, to circle back to your point about the use of it, there have been arguments that say, oh, we should only be able to use it for scientific purposes, not for commercial purposes. But then that, again, breeds so many questions of, well, if I mine it and then sell it to somebody who's going to use it for scientific purposes, is that okay? You know? So to me, it seems like, okay, once you extract it, you can do whatever you want with it. But in the process of extracting, what are we going to call that? When you have set something up on the moon or another celestial body, and you don't want somebody else coming in and taking it, right? That's let's just say it out loud. That's property, right?
I feel that there is a lot of probably a lot of agreement between countries that should be allowed, but I feel that there is some undertones of nobody wants to commit to how much they want to allow it.
Exactly, and the other thing is, again, when we think about countries that aren't spacefaring right now, and they're looking particularly at the moon. The moon is our closest neighbor. It's the easiest to get to. That's the Russians as well. And China and the United States are planning missions to the South Pole where we know all that water is. But the non-spacefaring nations are saying, well, you can't take all the resources on the moon before we get there. And that's right. I mean, that is a problem. When we think about one of the biggest precepts of the Outer Space Treaty is that space is the province of all humankind, and that the benefits should be shared by all. And so one of the biggest issues we have is, what does that mean? Benefits will be shared. Because some people think that means if you make $1 in space, you have to share that with everybody in the world. The other extreme is, look, no, everybody is benefiting from space. There's no question about that. When the Russians and the Americans sent those first military satellites into space to spy on each other, what were the benefits? Well, we got world peace, right? Or some sort of peace. And then it turned into remote sensing. And now we get our weather from satellites. We are able to address natural disasters better because of satellites. So we help now agricultural processes all over the world. So there are these benefits that nobody actually saw when we sent those first military satellites up, but everybody benefits from space. And that's something we have to keep in the back of our minds.
How is the treaty, or what are the limitations of the treaty to helping regulate what private companies can and do in space?
Now, this is actually a little bit more controversial, not controversial, but complex than you think, right? So it says you must authorize and supervise. So you think, okay, that's licensing. That's easy. And the United States in particular is a very robust licensing regime. I mean, you need to go through the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission. You might have to go to the Department of Commerce in order to get your approvals to go to space. But the continuing supervision, what does that mean? And when you think about all of the things that are happening in space now, all these new activities, to include tourism, how much do we have to regulate what a tourist does in space? Think about all the things a tourist will do in a space hotel. They will be brushing their teeth. Do we need to regulate how they brush their teeth? Article 6, you could argue it does, right? So again, this is one of those gaps that we're looking at. So we see a situation where our negotiators back in the 60s recognized that this would come up, but they just punted. They just, we kick that can down the road and we'll let somebody else deal with it. And now here we are dealing with it.
There is an agreement governing the activity of states on the moon and other celestial bodies, but neither US, USSR, and China have signed it. How are we dealing with these different treaties that some states are signatories, some other are not?
In the Outer Space Treaty, the very first sort of Magna Carta of space law, space is characterized as the province of all humankind. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. There's no legal definition, but it's something sort of, it feels good, right? In the Moon Agreement, space is characterized as the common heritage of humankind. Also not defined legally, but if you look at history, it's going in parallel with the Convention on the Law of the Sea negotiations, and that common heritage of humankind captures more of a sharing of the benefits concept, a global commons. If you do something, then you have to share all the profits that you receive from it. And it is more burdensome, if you will, to commercial entities and to nations to sort of think about, I have to be responsible now for everybody. And so it didn't gain a lot of signatories. 18 countries have ratified the Moon Agreement. And as you noted, the United States, Russia, and China have not signed it. And largely, again, because there's no definition of that term, common heritage of humankind. We don't know what that means from a legal standpoint. And then Saudi Arabia actually just announced in January 2023 that they were going to pull out of the Moon Agreement. So we have the very first time a nation has withdrawn from a space treaty. So it's very interesting to see what will happen with the Moon Agreement. But, Mexico, Australia have both ratified the Moon Agreement. France and India have signed it, but not ratified it. Austria has signed it and ratified it. I mean, the nations that have signed it, not the big three spacefaring, but they're very influential in terms of how we negotiate the following treaties. And so what I see, and the Moon Agreement has a lot of very good provisions in it. So I wouldn't call it a dead treaty. It still obligates the people who have signed it. I don't think any other countries are ever going to sign it, but we do have these countries now involved in negotiations. So Mexico and Australia in particular are parties to the Artemis Accords. And so we know that they are bound by both the Artemis Accords and the Moon Agreement. So they will have to make sure that whatever they agree to under Artemis is in keeping with the Moon Agreement. So that's a very positive path and a way to keep those really good ideas in the Moon Agreement alive.
I would like to ask a little clarification, because I heard that so many times that the International Space Station works like it's international waters.
They are incredibly different, right? So when we think about the Convention of the Law of the Sea that was negotiated at the same time as the Outer Space Treaty, what did it do? It actually codified, it was an opportunity to write down thousands of years of tradition and custom that had been built on the sea. We didn't look at a blank piece of paper and say, well, I don't know, let's just say this. No, we had all of these practices and traditions. And so the Convention of the Law of the Sea was basically codifying those traditions. We've been in space 50 years, tops, right? There are no traditions. There are no customs. We don't have that rich tradition to build on. And so we can't compare the law of the sea to the law of outer space because we don't have that rich tradition. And the sea is different from space. Just think about it from the point of view of dimensions, right? So on the ocean, you have the surface and you have below. And then anything above you is covered by aviation law. Well, if you've read Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, you know that in space, it's just you have above, you have below, you have either side. It's a very different domain than the ocean. You can't just take up those rules from the ocean and pop them into space. From a legal standpoint, also, the Convention of the Law of the Sea does state that the high seas are the common heritage of humankind. Outer Space Treaty says they're the province of all humankind. So we know even there's no definition of either one, but we know it's something different, and we know that province of all humankind is something less than common heritage of humankind. So I think there are things that we can borrow from the sea. For example, I've been reading up on maritime regulations about traffic management. And there's a deep tradition, again, built from years and years of how you classify a ship and who will have the right of way. That's a great system. and everybody abides by it internationally. That's the kind of system we need in space right now. Who has the right of way? If Starlink is going to cross the path of Chinese space station, who should be moving? Who should be? And so there is a parallel there that can be borrowed. The space station itself is really a creature. It's a unicorn. It is governed by its own agreement, the International Governmental Agreement, which just created all these rules specifically for space station. And it is held up there as sort of a beacon of how we can collaborate in space, because of course right now, even as Russia has invaded Ukraine and there's a war going on, we are still working together collaboratively on station. But that is sort of in and of itself a special creature, and something that we can all hope that we will continue to have as a model.
Let's imagine that we want to create a civilization out there in space. Could any nation, or maybe even a private company, establish a base elsewhere in space according to current laws and current treaties?
Absolutely. Anybody can. Back when Elon Musk first introduced Starlink, he put in his contract, if you were receiving Starlink services on Earth, then the laws of California and the United States apply. If you are receiving your Starlink services elsewhere, you recognize that no earthly law binds you, and we'll have some other. And everyone said, he can't do that, and I always say, well, he just did. So the question is, can you enforce it? So yes, if you have the money, you can go to Mars, and you can create Alfredoville, and you can have your own rules, absolutely. But you're going to be tethered to the United States, to the Earth, not necessarily to the United States, maybe to Italy or wherever. And you're going to need your supplies from Earth. You're not, as much as we'd like to, see you growing potatoes right away, it's going to take a while before you can do that. So there is always, as long as there's a tie to Earth, you are going to be bound by some government of Earth. And certainly you can run your settlement, your base, any way you want, but you will have to abide. The nation that you are currently trading with to get your food is going to say, well, we're not going to deliver food unless you assure us that all of your employees are safe and free, or something like that. So as long as you have that tether to Earth, you're going to be bound by some national government. Once you build your potato farms, you can do whatever you want. And I would love to say, no, you can't have a tyranny, you can't be authoritarian, you can't torture your people, but enforcement's going to be very hard. And so that's why, as a space lawyer, it's really important to build now into everybody's framework those rights and for all humans in space, and to build frameworks where it just becomes impossible to abuse people in space. But no, go for it.
Okay, let's assume that Alfredoville is not going to turn into a dictatorship straight away. Let's assume that, I don't know, I'm tethered to Italy and the UK, and I am very much in a borderless, internationalist kind of view of the world. If the idea would be to create something, an international effort, do you think it would be something that goes through the UN, or it could be something with its own accord, like the Artemis Accord? Do you think if there was a need or an interest from an international group, they would start it among a few nations and then maybe expand it, or do you think it would go through the UN and maybe the Space Treaty Agreement?
I think that it will not go through the UN, and because I think that the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, I think, is one of the most successful committees in the UN organization. However, there is tremendous distrust of the United Nations because of corruption and scandals. There is concern about benefit sharing, and I think as long as people are bound by their national identities, we're going to have issues because, the Chinese aren't going to want people to agree with the Americans very, right up front. Same with the Russians and, Iran, North Korea. So I actually believe that this new international community is going to thrive within the Outer Space Treaty System as a separate entity. I think it's going to come from commercial enterprises which don't look at nationalities, where UK, Italy, China, North Korea, it doesn't matter where you're from. If you are like-minded and want to be on Mars or wherever you have decided to settle. And I think that is the beauty of space, because we are really, as humanity, is really mired down by these sovereign ties right now, right? We are told that North Korea is terrible, and certainly you can separate the North Korean people from their dictator, but we're still not allowed, the United States citizens still are not allowed to go there. And we're seeing cracks in the sovereign system, in part because of cyberspace, right? Because we're able to get information and trade information. But I'm hoping that we're going to see even more as we venture into space. And when we get to space, my rose-tinted glasses vision of space is that we have an Artemis base on the moon, and we have a Chinese lunar research station on the moon, and they're both pretty close to each other on the South Pole, and something happens, and the Artemis partner has to go to China's base to say, hey, can we borrow some sugar? Who knows, right? And China says, no, you cannot share sugar with the Americans. And the person in the Chinese station on the moon says, that's bunk. We're all here in this very hostile environment. We're all human. We're going to help each other, and we're going to get peace from space.
What would I need to have legally for our little civilization to, as I said earlier, live long and prosper?
As a lawyer, I know people hate lawyers and they go, you're just there to say no. And I always tell people, if you don't like lawyers, it just means you've had very bad lawyers in your life. And I'm very sorry for that, because a lawyer's job is to say, yes, I will figure that out for you. Yes, sure, we can do that, but maybe we should do it this way. And so when I think about a community starting on Mars or some other celestial body, I have no idea what the laws should look like. How can I? I've never been off Earth. I'm happy to go, yeah, but somebody else will have to pay. But I have no idea. Like, how do you construct a legal regime where you don't have free access to oxygen? Where water is going to be ridiculously expensive, where you're confined in these spaces. I've been reading a lot into the ethics of space exploration, and these are brilliant thinkers who are thinking about colonies. How are we going to make sure the colonies are diverse and equitable, and that there's justice? Really, when we go to space, from a social standpoint, we're going back a century in time, because it's going to have to be almost militaristic, those first communities, because you're going to have very limited supplies. You're going to be in very limited habitation situations. And so you're going to have a lot of very strict rules. And so it's hard. I think that's the hardest thing that is going to have to be embraced, is that you are going to lose your privacy, a lot of your freedoms, and maybe even to some extent your freedom of expression, because we can't have a lot of people rocking the boat when, the boat is so fragile. And so we're looking at really a long way away before we have any of the things that we're used to in society here on Earth. So what will it look like? What can we do as anybody here on Earth to think about what that community should look like? We can start bettering ourselves. I mean, we need to set an example. And so we want to make sure that whoever goes there and starts that community is going to take the best of us and not the worst of us, because it's going to be very, very hard. And it's going to be very easy to trend towards sort of an authoritarian. But we need to take our centuries of history, all of the mistakes that we've made, and make sure they are sort of internalized into those future community dwellers in space.
What do you think are some of the most important steps that we need to take in the next decade or so?
We're all in this together, and we have to understand that. And I don't know how we get to that without it's that sort of chicken and the egg thing, right? Because we need to get more people into space. There's just shy of 700 people who have actually been able to see Earth from space and sort of understand that there are no borders. They're all human made. But slowly, I think, as we have tourists going to space, as we have more astronauts going to space, as we have two sets of astronauts going back to the moon, the Americans and the Chinese, really to start promoting even more this sense of collaboration. And again, I'm not saying that the United States and China are going to go singing into the sunset together, holding hands and skipping. But we can start to take steps to realize, okay, it's going to be better if we work together. One thing that I've been really interested by is, and in the United States, we've had congressional hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP. Used to be called UFOs, now they're UAPs, I guess. But it's interesting because what does that tell us? It tells us that we really need to work together, all of us on Earth, so that we understand what we're seeing, and so that we don't mistake something Chinese for something alien, or vice versa. So I really have high hopes that we're getting there. And again, with cyberspace, it's going to help us. But we need to own our humanity, and that is the only way we're going to survive.
I feel that some nice poetic language that can have enforceable things could be one of the next step to better our way into a space civilization.
Absolutely. And I just have to say, it's programs like the one you're doing that to reach out to people, to raise awareness. That's so important, because for too long, we've had a very, very tiny population dealing with space activities and understanding what we're doing. And that scares me, because it's not a diverse, it's probably not even 1% of the world that is involved in space. And yet it's going to affect everybody, anything that we do in space. And so the more people we can get involved, the better.
We are all for getting more and more people involved in space, and eventually maybe have Alfredoville on Mars.
I look forward to visiting.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for this fantastic talk.
Thank you. This was such fun, always.